Good morning.
I have marshmallows in my tea and my wife is not impressed.
No,
I
that
almost
is
put
wrong.
marshmallows in your tea.
You've got every Brit cringing right now.
Do I look like I'm a Brit?
No, definitely not with that tea. But you need it in hot chocolate, not tea.
Tastes good to me. Good morning, Sunday morning, and it's a beautiful day. Thank you for joining us. And we are busy in the middle of our, shall I say, interesting little series story, or shall I dare to say exciting?
You can dare to say both.
Dare to say both?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, to me it's exciting and interesting.
It's very interesting and eye-opening and plot twistish.
Oh,
It's like a plot twist, really.
Anyway, let's get going. So, this morning we are moving on to the second creation story. So, the series is called Are There Two Creation Accounts in Genesis? And we are focusing on Genesis 1 to 3. We have spent the first session we spent on identifying the idea of doublets in the Old Testament and specifically in Genesis. We spoke about the idea that Genesis or the Torah, even the whole Old Testament, is not written by one author, but it's a complex literary composition. And so when we read Genesis, we expect to see some doublets, and we do. The question is whether the two accounts, the two stories of creation in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, whether they are actually two different generation accounts. So we spend the following 2 sessions on having a look at Genesis 2 verse 4 to Genesis 3. And we try to read it afresh. We try to keep Genesis 1 out of our minds as we read it and just read it for what it was. And we came to a couple of conclusions, just some very, very simple things that can be eye-opening if you have the discipline to read it like you're reading it for the first time, which takes a bit of practice, and sometimes you need someone just to kind of nudge you along in that direction, because we're so used to reading it within our own tradition, our Christian tradition, that we can't see outside the box of that tradition sometimes. So some of the conclusions we came to, just simply that it's a very terrestrial account. God's very human-like. Women are like an afterthought in trying to find a companion for men. A couple of things, like the humans were created to basically work the ground and so on. And we'll come back to that in detail as we compare these two accounts in which will probably be our final session. But today we're going to be dealing with probably the most famous portion of the Bible, is definitely that of the Old Testament, and that is the very first couple of verses, chapter 1 and 1 or 2 verses of chapter 2. In the beginning God created, right? A very important verse being used much in philosophical debates and also scientific debates, as you might or might not be aware. And I would encourage people to, if this is something that does interest you, read. I would firstly recommend people read what's the word for an author that's well respected, scholars on the matter. Don't just read people that write within your own denomination or your own charismatic worldview, Christian charismatic worldview. Read people who have spent their lives working on this. The real plot to a story is really that, if I can summarize it like this, up until the 19th century, excuse me, the middle one, people who interpreted the Bible only had to deal with what was in the Bible. And so when we wanted to understand Genesis 1, for instance, we had to read it in terms of all the other scriptures in the rest of the Bible. And then we had to kind of come up with doctrines, ideas, dogmas that gives us an overall view what the Bible tells us about creation and what it must have been like. And that's why we end up with ideas like the snake had to be the devil, and there was a fall, and so on and so on. It helps us to make sense of the overall Bible. But what happens in the 19th century is the discoveries of archaeology. And besides the discoveries of actual archaeological finds like pottery and buildings and so on and so on, we also have the literature of the ancients that suddenly comes to front, and we now have people, I think they're called Assyriologists, and they have spent their life trying to decipher some of these very, very ancient Akkadian writings that we found in the libraries of Nineveh. They are very, very old. The writings are older than the biblical writings, and it took us a long time to decipher them, and they're actually not all deciphered yet. That's how much of them there are. So we're still at the beginning of this journey, really, but this information of what is in them has started to impact how people interpret the Bible, and the reason for that is simply that there are so many similarities between some of these very ancient texts and what we find in our Bibles. And so this throws a bit of a spanner in the works, because to interpret a portion like Genesis 1, you can't, if you want to be honest about it, you can't just read the Bible trying to interpret the Bible with the Bible. You have to go to other portions of ancient writings that has similar ideas in them, because if they are similar, it means they relate it in some way. And so this made people start to realize that the Bible is not a book that fell from heaven, written by the hand of God. That's not what it is. It's definitely a book that is, it can be inspired by God, but it was written by the hands of people who lived in that time, and the mark of that time is in our scriptures. And so it's impossible to now ignore those. Let me just have a sip of my warm marshmallow. The mark of the times, the contemporary times, are in our scriptures. And so to be honest now, is you have to take into account what is in. For instance, when we come to the first chapter of the book of Genesis, we now know that there were other ancient creation myths that are similar. So now to just ignore that and just keep on forcing our views, sometimes we force our modern views onto Genesis, would be, it's irresponsible, it's naive, and unfortunately it doesn't show proper diligence, right? And so from the 19th century, people who take the Bible and its context seriously has to take into account what is written in and around it, because it's obvious to everyone that let's speak about the Old Testament. Our Old Testament bears the mark of its time. Our Proverbs carry the mark of some Egyptian proverbs. Our Psalms have portions that look like polytheistic older Psalms. Some of our Psalms look like the Psalms or the songs of praise that were dedicated to the god Baal, for instance. Some of our creation stories look very much like Babylonian creation stories, and the list really goes on and on and on. We get to Noah, the Tower of Babel, all of these things. There's versions of this outside, so we have to bring them together to make sense.
Yeah.
Make sense of them. Of course, we can just close our eyes and say they don't matter, and this book is the only book that matter. But that is a dogma. That is a presupposition that we have built for ourselves.
Yeah.
And it actually, we are left being not properly honest about what's out there. And I think the best way to attack this or to approach is open up our eyes,
Honestly.
read what's out there, and come to conclusions. Use the brain that God has given us to come to proper conclusions and realize that some of the dogmas and some of the traditions we've inherited are not necessarily the gospel truth, as they say. Okay, so the first thing about Genesis that I want to say is that I've been reading Genesis for a very long time, excluding my early years as a teenager or whatnot. For the last 20 years as a pastor, I've been reading the book of Genesis. And I've gone through 3 phases of reading the book of Genesis. And I'm saying this to just shed a bit of light on Genesis 1. The first phase of reading Genesis is reading it like a kid, if I say that. Like reading it as if it is a real historical account of what happened. In other words, when I read in the first day, I believe in the first 24-hour period. When I read a snake is there, I believe that's a real snake and he's really talking. It's a literal way of reading it, right? Without any sophistication. The second way of reading it, and that I came to about 10 years ago, is I started realizing that we can't read this so literally. And the way I started realizing it, is there's a lot of things in the chapter, especially in the first story, Genesis, that if you read it literally, it contradicts reality. And it contradicts what we have learned through science about the creation, about the universe, how it functions, and the order in which it probably came to be. And so that led me on a course of trying to marry these two. I'm going to use the word harmonize for now. Trying to marry relevant science to this ancient story about creation, trying to fit ideas like evolution or cosmological evolution, trying to fit that into the creation story. And there's a lot of people that do that. And I read multiple books on how to actually do that. And I thought I was rather successful about it. Back then, I wasn't really willing to talk about it too much because I think it was, as it is now, probably a very controversial type of topic. But it's something I did in my own time that I kind of kept to myself, and maybe people very close to me would have known. But I've come to a final place. Well, I wouldn't say final, but the next phase is I realized that I never took into account any of the extra biblical evidence that is out there.
Biblical.
Extra biblical. And so evidence that lies outside the Bible. Other creation stories that we find in ancient times. And it seems to me that when we now include that, and that's the process I've been talking about, when we do include them, I've come to the conclusion that it's not possible to marry scientific ideas with Genesis 1. And I've also come to the conclusion that was not how it was written. The people who wrote this did not understand relativity. They did not understand cosmological evolution. They simply did not know how the universe works today. And they didn't write from that vantage point. But they had a completely different mind from which they were writing. And so I started reading books by people who this is what they do. They study ancient religions, ancient Mesopotamian texts, and bring together all the stories of biblical stories and the ones outside and show how they are similar to try and map the mindset of the ancient people. And then it became very obvious to me that these ancient people did not have a scientific mind in the way that we have science today.
Yeah.
They had what is maybe more a phenomenological mind, which means they wrote it as they saw it. They described it as they could understand it. They're trying to make sense of their ordered world. And so this is the place where I am at the moment, is that I've realized that actually these early accounts of creation fit very well within their own time. They're trying to convey something, and that thing is not always, it's almost never trying to make science right or the Bible right versus science. It's just not the fight that's going on here. So I just want to say that before we start, so that you know from which angle we'll be coming into this book this morning. Okay, so the first thing we need to tackle quickly is the very first verse. The verse starts like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then there's a full stop. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Full stop. But an and. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Okay, so when we read that, this hasn't changed since King James, and almost all our Bible translations, mostly the evangelical ones, they all read more or less exactly like this. But it has become quite obvious to me, as I've read the Jewish side of this, and the scholars that really take this seriously, that this first verse is kind of actually one verse. And it's not giving us a chronology, really. What it's really saying, and I've got a little, from one of the textbooks that from one of the books that I've read, sorry, I might have closed it now. Where's this one? Oh, there it is. It's better read like this, one sentence that tries to create for us and sketch for us what it was like when God started creating. So it's not the modern scientific idea of the Big Bang where there's nothing and now suddenly, boom, there's something. It's more, in the beginning when God started creating, the earth was void the waters was there, the deep was there, and his spirit hovered on the deep. And so our initial condition for this, well, let me just read it. In the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was chaotic and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind or spirit from God swept over the face of the waters. So the point here is very simple. My notes. Okay. The point here is very simple, that Genesis 1 is not trying to convey the modern scientific idea that there was nothing and then God made everything into existence. That's not what's going on here. Rather, what it is saying is that there already was chaos. The earth was chaotic, everything was, the waters was there, and the Spirit of God was hovering. So the initial picture, if you want a photo of this, is not nothing. The initial photo is the earth is there, and there's just this chaotic water that's over and above the earth, and there's nothing else. There's no life. There's just absolute chaos. So that's really the initial picture that we should be picking up in here. Now, of course, chaos is a very, very important word if you're reading any ancient type of cosmology or mythology, because the ancient gods were always seen, the creator gods were always seen as those who produced order out of chaos. Right? Yeah. That's why cosmos, the simple meaning of the word is an orderly arrangement, because from chaos, cosmos. Okay, so.
But does this first verse say chaos, or is that the
yes, chaotic. This word, the dark, it was, sorry, hold on. The earth was without form and void. That word, I think it's tohu vohu, it literally means there was chaos. There's chaos upon the face of the deep. In other words, there's no order. It's not empty because it's there, but it's not ordered. So most of the ancient myths are concerning themselves with order. Once again, as we saw with the second story, many of these go to show or try to explain how the world came to be as it is today. So when an ancient, and us as well, when we look at our world, there's an order in this. This is not chaos. There's a lot of order. You plant a seed, it brings forth its own. Like there's something behind that. Water is there, land is here. You can imagine an ancient doesn't really understand the world map and how waters work, but they all know, they just know that the seas don't come past those points. That's the place for sea. This is the place for land. Birds live in the sky. That's the place for the birds. Everything is ordered. They saw that the stars were moving in patterns. The sun and moon was moving in patterns. In other words, in their view, the gods turned the chaos into this amazing order that we have today. And so the Israelites too believed that their God Yahweh, he turned the chaos into this order. And so what you then find in Genesis as we're going through this is not, as we mentioned last time, really an ex nihilo, out of nothing, now there's something. This is really actually a forming process from chaos into order. Now, if you do any extensive reading on the subject, that's the conclusion that you're going to come to, right? I can't deal with all of the intricacies, but any respected scholar understands that's what's going on in Genesis. And one of the reasons we know is once we've seen the other forms, we recognize the patterns across these forms, that's what's going on. Maybe I can just say at this point that maybe the other ancient creation myth that's most comparable to the biblical account is the famous Babylonian Enuma Elish. And in the Enuma Elish, you have the same initial condition. You have chaotic waters. But there, the waters is depicted as a god. Tiamat is her name. She's a goddess. And she is the chaotic waters. Sometimes she's predicted or depicted as a sea monster.
Oh.
Yeah. And so any real god that was creator god, like Marduk, for instance, the Babylonian god, is often depicted with his head on the sea monster, because he took the chaos sea monster, and out of that chaotic water, she's the goddess of salt water, he turned this into order. We have land, and then the animals and humans, and so on and so on. So I'm running a little bit ahead of myself, but I don't think there'll be too much harm in me repeating this later, but this is one of the structural similarities we have between Enuma Elish, for instance, and the biblical account. And that is simply that, like, our paper keeps going down. God creates order out of this water chaos, right? But in the biblical account, there's no goddess. But the waters in the biblical account is called Tehom. I think Tehom is how you say it. And it's a cognate. It's linguistically related to Tiamat. And out of the chaos waters, he creates this massive order. And so some say the biblical writers making a very important point here, that there are no chaos gods, and that the sea is simply a servant of God, and that there's only one God that rules over the elements of creation. And some say this was a reactionary writing of the Jews that were in Babylonian exile, saying that no, it doesn't work like this, it works like this, but in doing that, they have the same structure. So it's not that, and I think this is important to understand, it's not like the biblical writers copied Babylonian creation myths. That's not, I don't think anyone that reads the two accounts seriously would say that. But what is apparent is that they inadvertently using the same structure. First there's darkness and chaos and water, and then God separates the waters, and out of that space he then puts living things inside of it. The biblical account does exactly that, and the order is more or less the same. And there's questions that arise out of that, like why? Why is this the same? And that's not something I want to answer today. I've already spent too much time on this first verse. Right, so we want to read Genesis 1 from a fresh perspective, trying to not read into it what we've previously been told. We're going to forget Genesis 2 from verse 4 as much as we can. We're going to read this as an isolated account. We can try and learn something about the character of God, the way in which he orders, the way in which he forms, from reading through this account. Okay, so our initial setting we've already seen is chaotic waters, and this is upon the earth. Now, if you want to visualize this, the best way, I guess, to visualize it is from the ancient Mesopotamian cosmology is a flattish type of earth with this chaotic waters over it, right? Mm-hmm. And then what happens is the waters are separated horizontally, and it does this, so that now waters are still on the earth at the bottom here, but now there's also water at top. So it's like just a little, everything else is chaos water, but just here is a little bubble or a dome, we can call it, right? And it's in this space that God does everything. Humans, animals, birds, sea life, sun, moon, and stars. So in ancient cosmology, Mesopotamian cosmology, and also Israelite cosmology, you would have a dome shape. Some use the idea of a snow globe almost. Everything else is water, and you have ground and sea at the bottom, and you have sea at the top, and there's this firmament. It's called a firmament in the King James. There's a very good reason for that, because they believed that it was a dome shape. Some believe it was brass. Others, it's something solid that keeps this massive water at the top. And then inside this dome, all the life springs comes into being. Okay, so that's something that Babylonian creation myth and the biblical creation myth has the same. Mm-hmm. So it's a weird idea for us as moderns.
Yeah.
The fact that their idea, the Babylonian idea, and the biblical idea is the same, mm-hmm. means there's a relatedness there. We're not sure exactly what it was. We know Enuma Elish is older than the biblical accounts, that we know. But we're not sure how they're related. So some people say, and I'll just end with this, some people say that the Israelites, when they went into Babylon in captivity, that's kind of where they came in contact with this type of idea, maybe. Even if they had this idea within themselves before, it looks like the biblical account is in reaction to the Babylonian polytheistic account, where the Israelite account is monotheistic, humans are not slaves, they're in the image of God, etc., etc. Okay, so that's the first picture. We have this just chaotic waters on a flat disk of the earth, right? And on top of this, we have two things. We have darkness, but we also have the Spirit of God. And there's the Spirit of God just hovering over this whole chaos mess, right? And it's completely dark. So you can think maybe of a night on ocean, pitch dark night on a stormy ocean with no land to see. Kind of that scary, like really scary type of scenario, and maybe a shark fin or something like that.
Let's not go that far.
But then something beautiful happens out of this absolute chaos. God speaks. And as he speaks, he creates with his mouth, right? So the first little creation is found in verse 3. And it says, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided light from darkness. So this is the first, what we call a separation. Let me say this in advance. What you'll find, the first 3 days are separations. And the last 3 days are fillers of those separations. So God makes space and then he fills it. And he makes space and then he fills it. It's actually, once you see it, you can never ever unsee it again, Jory. The literary structure of this is, it's really beautiful. It's genius. But once you see it as a literary structure, you have to start realizing that this is not a historical, scientific account.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so he says, let there be light, and then he separates light from darkness, and he calls this darkness, he calls night, and he calls this light, he calls day. So you can understand why this is a phenomenological writing, because this is what a human experiences. In the day, there's light, and then there's this period of darkness.
So he separated them with time.
Well, from the writer's perspective, that's kind of what's
Because I was
going
just
on.
thinking, how do you separate light and dark?
Yeah.
How do
Well, possibly, yes. Because from the writer's perspective, his whole life, there's dark, then there's light. There's dark, then there's light. So he's writing as if in the beginning it was only dark. So where did light come from? God made this light. He made it into, he spoke it into existence. And then from that time on, there was this separation between light and darkness. So we still have chaotic waters. We still have the Spirit of God possibly hovering, but we don't have this constant darkness anymore. Now we have light, dark, light. So it's moving in a great direction. You know, when you're scared, put the light on, happy. You can see the predators. That fear is kind of gone. So he called the light day, and he called the night, the darkness night. And it was evening and morning the first day. All right, great. So what happens on the first day? God separates light he creates light, and he separates the light from the darkness. All right. Then, verse 6. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. So this is that separation from all the waters now is still upon this, on the earth. And now there's no space. Up here it's all water all the way through. So now he creates a firmament, a dome, that sits like this. And now there's space here between the waters that are now above and the waters that are below, right? So now suddenly there's this, I don't want to say vacuum, but this may be the best way to understand it. This vacuum of space that goes light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. We still have a problem, there's no land. But there's what is created here is the sky. Right here, in this account, it's called the heaven. But don't get confused here. It's not talking about the place you want to go to when you die. It's not what it's talking about. In fact, the early Israelites of this period did not believe people went to heaven when they died. Right? That's just not a belief. This is just not present there at this time. So it's talking about the sky. So we've got water, we got sky, and we got this strong firmament, the solid thing that's now keeping the waters up. One of the reasons why people say that they believe that the waters were separated is because every day they look up and they see a blue expanse above them. What is that? What is that blue stuff? So they believed it was water. Another reason for that is when it rains, of course. When it rains, water is coming from that massive water from the top. So this is apparently how the belief came about, that there was actually a massive water drop. And who did it? God did it. He took a firmament and he placed it to keep that water back. And so now you have a space, you have sky, air space, and you have night and day, but you still have water at the bottom and water at the top. Right. God made a firmament, and this is how he divided the waters, which are under the firmament, from the waters that are above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament sky, or heaven, in most of our translations. And the evening and the morning, and it was the second day. All right. So, are we taking this as literal days? Should we be taking it as literal days? I most certainly don't. I think it's a literary device. I'm not sure how you see that or how you would like to see that. The word day there is yom. It also means hot. There were times in my life where I believe that these days were millions of years, but I think it's a bit ridiculous to think like that. I think it's a literary device. Anyway, you make of it what you like. Okay, so what happens next? So we've already had the separation of light and dark. Now we have the separation that creates the airspace. The waters are separated, so we have airspace. And now the next separation that takes place is the water that is at the bottom here gets separated into land and sea. And you can see how the writer is forming the world
explaining it.
He's explaining how we have this order. That the water, it doesn't rain all the time, and the sky of water doesn't collapse on us. And why the seas stay where they are, and we have some dry land and some sea. So, verse 9, and God said, let the waters under the heaven, under the sky, be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and he gathered it together, the waters, and he called them the seas. And God saw that it was good. And then what he does, the moment that the land appears, of course, now what's next? Well, God said, let the earth bring forth the grass, the herbs, seed, fruit-yielding trees, after their own kind, whose seed is inside themselves upon the earth, and it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after its kind. And God saw that it was good. All right. So, that was now the fourth day, wasn't it? 1, 2, 3. That was the third day. So the third day is a separation between land and water. And as the land and water separates, the land becomes fertile, and it creates all the things humans and animals would need to live off. Right, so it's creating the right space on land now.
Yeah.
By separating ground and sea, it's creating space. It's separation for space, and that space is filled with trees and herbs, and it explains how things work with the seed that's in it, and you plant and it brings forth after its own kind. So here's the first three separations that take place. So the separations are done. Everything is ready now for life. The animal life, the life of the animated, which would include beasts, birds, fish, and then of course the crowning part of this creation, of course, is the humans. All right. So, now, once the third day is finished, now here's the fourth day. Now look what happens to the fourth day. It says, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament. So the first thing God now does is he fills the firmament with lights. These are stars. So the ancients believed that the stars were inside the firmament. Right? They were here, they were hanging in this dome. The sun, moon, and stars were all just here, because of course above that there's waters. So you have all of them. So God created the space, and now he's chucking stuff into it. Right? Lights in the firmament to divide day from night. Let there be signs for seasons and days and years. And this explains to the reader why the stars can be interpreted to follow seasons, days, and years. Of course, now the two greater lights comes next, which is the sun and the moon. They are understood to be lights. Scientifically, there's lots of problems here. The moon is not a light. Secondly, the sun is made here on the fourth day. We've had day and night from the very beginning. We know it's the sun that gives us our light. So scientifically it doesn't match, and I think you just have to be honest about it.
Yeah.
It doesn't match, it's not supposed to match. They didn't understand how things work. They didn't know the earth was rotating.
Yeah.
They didn't know any of that, right? So in terms of the writer, God now fills the sky with the lights. And of these two lights, there's two of these lights that are very special. And it's obvious, if you live on earth, of course these two lights are special. In the day there's this massive ball of fire, and at night there's this cool LED hanging in the sky, the moon. These are the two lights that they govern seasons. They obviously trying to explain here as well how the moon shifts over time, full moon to sickle moon. They govern seasons. Some go as far as say that this was the Israelites' way to explain that the sun, moon, and stars are not there to predict astrology like the Babylonians would have done, but it's actually there so they can calendar and date their feasts of the year. Maybe not, don't know. The one thing I would like to mention here is that one thing that was very important in the ancient days was the recognition of the planets. So the planets, if you look out at night, sometimes you look up to the sky, you see a planet, it looks like a star. Now we know, we look at it, it's not a light source, if it's not flickering, it's actually a planet, it's not a star. But the other way that they identified the planets in ancient times is the planets were moving relative to the background of the stars. And so that's actually where the word planet comes from. Planon is the Greek for a wanderer. So these were the wandering stars, were the planets that were moving together with the sun and moon relative to the background of the sea of stars. They were called the wandering stars, basically. 5 planets, sun and moon, and a lot of scholars say this is where the number 7 gets its original holiness from. Is that in the sky there were 7 wandering stars that were governing the times and seasons, and this is why 7 became such a very important number. Of course, in ancient Mesopotamia, in many other religions, and of course the Bible picks this number 7 up in this portion in a very, very special way, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so there's lights. There's the 2 great lights. They rule the day. The one rules the day, the other one rules the night. And then there's stars. And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day, to rule over night, to divide light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and it was evening and morning, and it was the 4th day. So the 4th day is a filling of the sky, right, with the lights. Now on the 5th day, God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that has life." So now God is busy filling the sea, right, and He brings forth these. He fills the sea. Second part, "And fowl that might fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven." He fills the air, the sky. And then God, King James says, He made great whales and every living creature that moves, which was brought forth abundantly. So He fills the water, He fills the air, and He fills the land. The space He's created, He fills it with living, breathing animals, right? The word whale here is a little bit, personally, from all the ancient reading I've been doing, the word whale here is actually, it's a word that's used for a sea monster, right? And the reason why I think that was the original meaning is that's kind of what we find in the other myths. We see sea monsters in the ocean, but in the Bible as well, in Jonah and Job, and I think a place in the Psalms, there's a mention of God that kills the sea monster, literally, Tori. So I didn't write it down. Maybe I'll pop it in next time. But there are these portions where God kills the sea monster, and it's like very, very weird. And some people believe it's dinosaurs, and I think it's completely off. But to think it was dinosaurs, I think it fits much better to understand how the Israelites understood the beginning of all things. The way that God creates, a figurative way of understanding how He creates, is He has to kill the sea monster. But anyway,
Sure.
it's neither here nor there.
Is this the same word whale as Jonah and the whale?
Yeah, it's very much the same type of word, yeah. Okay, all right. But no, sorry, no. No, not that one. It's in Jonah, but it's not that
Not
one.
the one who swallows
Not
him
the
up,
one.
the
No,
big fish.
the one who swallows anyone. Okay, I've got 5 minutes left here. So anyway, God fills the space, right? Great whales, living creatures. God saw them was good, and God blessed them. And He said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the waters in the sea, and let the fowl multiply in the earth." And that's the 5th day. Okay, so there's only one filling that's left. So what happens next? In the 6th day, now it's time for the animals, the cattle, the beasts of the field. And so God said, let the earth bring forth living creature after its kind, cattle, every creeping thing, beasts of the earth after its kind. And so it was. And God made the beasts of the earth after its kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth and after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And now we get to the main part, right? Because it's about us. And God said, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness." So the crescendo of the story, everything is set up. The spaces are created, the light is created, the waters are lifted, the waters are separated from the dry land, the vegetation is placed on the dry land, the birds, the fish, the cattle, everything is ready now. Let's make now a man, a human, in our image and in our likeness. So we're going to build, the word image and likeness here, I've spoken about it so much in my life, but it simply means a representative of ourselves. And so God places the human as a representative of himself in the earth. And it's notable here that I don't think there's another example in ancient writings where humans are the image and the likeness of God, in the sense where every human, this is what this is saying, the whole human race is image and likeness. I think you might find spots of a king being image and likeness of a god over the people. But this is, I think, novel in these times, that humans themselves, as the race of humans, are actually the image and the likeness of God. And then God gives these humans power to subdue animals and the birds and everything, right? So there's a high view of humans in this story,
Yeah.
right? So then, of course, God creates man in his own image and in the image of God. Of course, we have another "let us," which puzzles, right? Definitely not the Trinity. If you listen to the previous sessions, the Trinity the concept doesn't exist for another almost 1,000 years. Like it's wrong to read the Trinity back into this. At best, God is talking to possibly what the Jews understood as the angels, seraphim, I don't know, any type of living being, celestial, divine type of being. And at worst, for Christians, there is a council of gods, which we find often through the Old Testament, in Job, in the Psalms, that God sits with and consults with and delegates work to. That could be what's going on here as well. Okay. So, God blessed them, and He said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and every living thing that moves upon the earth." And God said, "Behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree." Just remember that. Every tree.
And he just makes male and female
Yes.
same time.
Yeah, that's
and
my
he
next
says-
point. Yeah. So let's talk about that. Like, in this story, God makes male and female. Boom, there they are.
Dare I say equals.
Yes. And so a lot of people take the two stories, we're running ahead, but they take the two stories and they manipulate and they bring them together to try and show that they're equal. But the second story, they're not. But in this story, and this is one of the reasons why people believe this story is a much later story. It's more advanced in the way that it thinks. It's talking about how things came to be the way they are. God is far, He's not there planting, making clothes. He's not like a Greek god in their midst, walking in the garden, talking. They don't say where He is. He's just speaking, and things are just happening. Like He's otherworldly to some degree in this type of, at least from a modern point of view. But Okay, so yes, well pointed out. The other thing here is there's no restrictions on trees. It's just there. Everything is here. There's no garden. Some spot somewhere where man has to work in. It's just everything is here and it's beautiful. And there's no mistakes, no second takes, no God who doesn't know what's going on or asking questions. He just lets everything be, and everything is good and beautiful, and he blesses it because he loves what he's done. Um, yeah, okay. So, beast of the earth, he gives them the beast of the earth, the fowl of the air, everything that creeps upon the earth, everything that has life. I've given you every green herb for meat. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was good. And the evening and the morning were the 6 days. The sixth day. And so 6 days of this God speaking and just things just coming. Space, 3 times separation of space, and then 3 times the filling of that space. And everything now is the way we see it now. This is how this happened. This is why there's air, water above.
Yeah.
This is why there's dry land. That's why we are animals. We are more intelligent than them. We eat them. We hunt them. They kill us occasionally, but more. We are the ultimate species, if you want to say that. It's built into this here. It's because God gave us dominion over everything. And in fact, we are in his likeness and his image. And that's a pretty special thing. If there's any really, for me, if there's any real thing you want to take away from the story for your personal life, on a spiritual note, it's that portion.
Yeah.
That in the view of this writer, humans are the image and the likeness of God. And that was a rather novel idea for this time. In other Mesopotamian creation stories, men are literally made to till the earth and feed the gods. They're basically slaves in that sense. But this is not where this ends. I know you have a chapter ending here, but remember that wasn't part of the original form. We're going to continue reading until we get to our heading, which we've identified earlier on in the series. We identified kind of like section headings called, and these are the generations of the heavens and the earth, or in other times, these are generations of Adam and Noah, and so on and so on and so on. Go back to the previous sessions if you want clarity on that. So this account continues by saying, thus the heavens and the earth were finished. So you have a full story from chaos into beautiful order that is blessed, and God said, this is very, very good, right? They all finished, all the host of them. But on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And he blessed the 7th day, and he sanctified it. He made it a holy day, right? Because that it had rested, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God had made. And that's where this account ends. So I want to say a couple of things about the 7th day, because it's a very interesting idea. Firstly, I want to say I've identified before that the idea of 7 is not a biblical, it didn't originate with the Bible, right? It seems like it actually originated with astronomy. There's 5 planets and the sun and moon as the 7 great lights of the sky, the wandering stars. And that's where it gets its great significance from. But also, if we read ancient Mesopotamian literature, specifically religious literature, 7 is a prominent figure. And it does seem that sometimes there is a notion that when they built temples to gods, finally the last thing they do in that temple is they place the image of the temple, of the god inside the temple. And that signifies that God coming to rest in that temple now. And this was often in 7-day period. So there was a 7-day kind of like a feast in which at the end of that, they placed this statue, this image. And then that God, whatever it was, Enlil or whatever, he now rests in that temple. This is why some scholars, some of the most prominent scholars on these issues, like someone like John Walton, and I've even heard N.T. Wright use this theme, they believe, and I'm paraphrasing them so don't hold them to anything, but that this account of Genesis is actually a temple creation account. but mapped onto cosmos. That God, the writer is saying God has made the heavens and the earth as his temple. He makes everything in it. He makes the space, and then he puts all the ornaments, he puts everything in there that he loves and makes and is beautiful, and then he comes and he rests. In the same way that an ancient statue of a god would come and rest inside the temple of that ancient god, which makes so much sense to me. But I want to throw something in here that is just something I picked up along the line, and speaking under correction, but to me there's a chance that the idea of Sabbath is actually does not come from here, but that the seventh day as a rest day was written into this. And this is why we rest on the seventh day, because God's rest on the seventh day, and that's why it's holy, that's why we can't do anything. One of the reasons for that is in the triplets we find, actually it's a quartet that we find in the Old Testament of the Ten Commandments. In two of them, when it comes to the Sabbath, when it says, and you will keep the Sabbath holy, you will do no work on it. The one says you will do that because God did that. But the other one says you won't work on the seventh day because your slaves need a break. And I'm paraphrasing terribly. But it's interesting to me that there'd be two different reasons for the Sabbath. If the creation account was the real only reason why we shouldn't do anything on the seventh day, why is there another reason in one of the Ten Commandments that's a completely different thing? So in my view, this is just a hunch I have, is that there's a big chance that this was actually, remember this wasn't written, this is not the first book written in the Bible. And it wasn't written in creation, when the creation happened. It was written probably in the 6th century, and finally edited probably in the 6th century. That's long after they were doing law and all of that. So there's a big chance that this seventh day actually comes from the rest that they were already practicing for some reason. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for today. Let me just see if there's anything like that I've separated oh yeah, there is one thing I need to say. One thing you might not have noticed, it's so important, is that the word for, and this actually is terribly important, the name for God used in this account is not Yahweh Elohim, like in the second one. It's only Elohim. Now this is weird. It's very strange. If this is the same writer writing a creation account of one account folding out of the other, which I believe for many years, why has he changed the name of God? That is a very strong indicator that we're dealing with two different things. Okay, so this is something you need to take note of. God is not called Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God. He's just called God Elohim, which Elohim was a very general term for God, and was actually...
Could not be plural?
It can be plural, and it was also used by the Ugaritic literature for their God. So it's very, very general, very general. God is not terrestrial here. Okay, we'll do things. We'll do the comparison next week. I think I need to end. My time is kind of up, so I don't want to say too much more. I want to do a little bit more of a comparison with Enuma Elish. Maybe you can do that next week.
Slowly next week,
Yeah.
otherwise you rush it.
Yeah, I don't want to rush. And then next week we're going to end off by comparing the two creation stories, because if
They're so different.
if the one just unfolds is a better telling of a small period of the other, then there shouldn't be any contradictions. But if we find contradictions in these two stories enough, then we got to start realizing that we are dealing with two different stories that were edited together. They were seen together because they both explain two different things.
Yeah.
The one explains how we have this beautiful order. The other one explains why we're suffering and dying all the time. And the editors believed that it was more important to keep both, that both were important to them. We'll leave it at that. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next week. Yes.
Bye.